Fellows Speaker Series event, Is It Time to Try Socialism? Socialism has been steadily rising in the American political vocabulary, especially during the past few years, where we have seen the topic explode. Now with the likes of individuals like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, leading a new movement of democratic socialism, we are in the midst of a great public debate. It is therefore fitting that we have a conversation on our campus so as to better our knowledge and improve campus dialogue surrounding this topic. Hopefully our debate tonight can help spur that conversation at Notre Dame. The format of the debate will be as follows. The pro-socialism side will speak first for 20 minutes, followed by the anti-socialism side for 25 minutes. And finally, the pro-socialism side will conclude for 5 minutes at the end with rebuttals. Then after this, there will be a Q&A that will follow. We will have anonymous Q&A functioning through Slido, which we will talk about after. And then we'll also have questions from the audience in person with these microphones there. Before we introduce our speakers, we'd like to thank our newest sponsors. They include the American Studies Department, the first year of studies, the Notre Dame Scholars Program, the Program of Liberal Studies, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, the Political Science Department, the Constitutional Studies Department, the History Department, the Gender Studies Department, the College of Arts and Letters, the Mendoza College of Business, the Anthropology Department, the Center for the Study of Anthropology Department, the Center for the Study of Religion and Societies, and the Institute for Scholarship in the Liberal Arts. Without their support, this event would not be possible. We'd also like to thank the event staff at the Mendoza College of Business for all of their help, as well as everyone that made this event possible. Thank you. Now I will turn it over to fellows Molly Murphy and Emma Shia to introduce our speakers.
J.W. Richards, PhD, OP, is an assistant research professor in the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America, the executive editor of The Stream, and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute. Richards is author or editor of a dozen books, including the New York Times bestsellers Infiltrated and Indivisible, and Money, Greed, and God, winner of a 2010 Templeton Enterprise Award. His newest book is The Human Advantage, The Future of American Work in the Age of Smart Machines. He is also creator and executive producer of several documentaries, including 3 that have appeared widely on PBS. Richards' articles and essays have been published in the Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Washington Post, Forbes, Fox News, National Review Online, The Hill, Investor's Business Daily, Washington Times, The Philadelphia Inquirer, The Huffington Post, The Federalist, The American Spectator, The Daily Caller, and many other publications. He has written and lectured on a wide range of topics, including culture, economics, public policy, natural science, technology, and the environment. Thanks.
Bhaskar Sunkara is the founding editor and publisher of Jacobin. He's a columnist for The Guardian and the author of the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. Sunkara writes for Vice Magazine, The New York Times, Washington Post, and The Nation, among other outlets. He has appeared on programs for PBS and MSNBC and has been interviewed by The New York Times and The New Left Review and Vox. Please join me in welcoming our participants.
Well, thank you all for having me. Notre Dame is not known for its radical politics necessarily, though many other wonderful things. So I jumped at the opportunity. So special thanks to the organizers, particularly John Henry, for handling all the logistics and everything like that. And I don't even remember half the organizations that co-sponsored this because there was a long list. I see they each brought 2 people, but thank you all for coming. And so I guess I'll begin by saying that, yes, I think it's time that we give socialism a try. I think the answer should be a resounding yes to that. We live in a country amid the wealth that our common endeavors have created, where millions live in poverty, millions have no savings or saddled with debt. They're one medical accident away from destitution. People in the United States are trying hard. They're working longer than their peers in other developed nations. They're trying to take care of their families. When they're laid off at work, when they deal with health insurance companies or student loans, they're bombarded with the message, though, that it's your fault. Lost your job? You should have taken a coding class. Or reformat your CV. Have to see a doctor? You should have eaten more apples. In student debt, you should have created an app instead of going to college. The socialist message, and more broadly, the message of the movement around Bernie Sanders is simple. It's not your fault. There are social problems out there that are plaguing you, and these social problems have collective solutions. And you can't expect the state or any of these collective solutions to solve all of your problems, but they could at least give you a fair shot at success. And if we take on the millionaires and billionaires who benefit from the way things are, we could change this country for the better. And I think, by the way, that this is a message that will have more resonance in the next 10, 20, 30 years than the "it's your fault" message. So let's start with a definitional point, what I mean by democratic socialism. Democratic socialists believe that too much of life is the result of accidents of birth. We want a society that at the very least guarantees the core necessities of a good life: housing, healthcare, education, childcare. These things should be social rights, not commodities reliant on the ability of one to pay. If we guaranteed these basics, we could ensure that everyone would be free to reach their full potential, to flourish in their individuality, and to contribute to society where others have the same opportunity. Democratic socialists believe that political democracy is good. We want to see it defended and expanded, but we also want to see it extended into social and economic realms as well. If we think that democracy is a good thing at the ballot box, why should our workplaces be run as dictatorships? Why shouldn't we trust in the abilities of ordinary people with ordinary intelligences to help shape the decisions that shape their lives? This all sounds good, maybe, but does it work in practice? I would say that we know that social democracy works. Socialist parties across Europe, most successfully in Scandinavia, were able to take power in the 20th century. With the aid of affiliated labor unions, they ushered about sweeping changes, securing political democracy, welfare state guarantees, and high-wage, high-productivity economies. There were still inequities in this society, but these were far freer societies than the one me and you live in today. My use of freedom might sound surprising to those of you who were taught that at best socialism is about trading in some form of freedom for some amount of equality. But in my mind, socialism is really about asking the question, freedom for whom? Say you're working for me, and I own a software company or some other company. Now, there's a lot of fixed costs to keep my company going: servers, computer equipment, things like that. And it makes sense that I want whatever assets I invested capital in to actually be used throughout the day. So very reasonably, through no personal malice or ill intent, I want my employees, I want you to work 11 or 12 hours a day. And maybe I want you to work 6 days a week. You need a job, and then you enter into an employment contract with me under these terms. Now, on the face of it, it's a free choice. But work or starve is really, a contract under duress. But say we have a pro-working class president and a Congress committed to reform. And this Congress passes legislation that limits the workday to 35 hours at the same pay that you were given for working 50 hours a week before. And Congress insists that employers hire extra workers if they need those extra hours covered. Now, those 4 hours a day that's lost, those 4 hours a day of production, that restriction on what I can do as a boss with my private property, this workplace that I own, means that I'm having my freedom eroded. But it also means that you're having your freedom enhanced. You now have 4 hours a day to do whatever you want with. You could sit at home and watch basketball. You could take care of your children. You could learn a new language, or you could do absolutely nothing. That's your choice. Now, a certain bedrock of civil and political liberties must be guaranteed to all. They can't be eroded. But the question is, do we prioritize the freedom of the majority or the freedom of the minority that owns private property? By private property, I don't mean your car, your home, things that belong just to you. What I mean is these workplaces and institutions where labor is convened together and that socially created wealth is made. Now, democratic socialists, unlike more authoritarian strains of socialism in the past, don't oppose liberal rights. What we do is we seek to realize them. Now, think about a country like India. India, unlike China, unlike many other countries, actually has a bedrock of civil rights. There's actually a bedrock of liberal rights in India. So you have, for example, relatively free press in India. But there's also around 40% of the population that's functionally illiterate. So a socialist would ask, we wouldn't say this right of the free press is useless, we should get rid of it. What we would say is that wouldn't a right to a free press mean more if there were enforced social guarantees to a robust and effective education? If in fact the people of India were able to, as guarantees, have effective education and have time free from endless work and toil to actually reach their intellectual potentials. Now, this is the bedrock of social democracy. This is what I defend and fight for today. The welfare state guarantees to allow people to reach their potential. Now, the question that will arise is, what else do you want? What makes you a socialist? And I'll get to that later. And that's about more radically extending democracy into the workplace and allowing people to receive the full fruits of their labor. But the question immediately should come up, how do we get these nice things? How do we enhance the material security and freedom for ordinary people and at least guarantee the basics of a good life to everyone? Now, capital and labor are dependent on each other, but it's an asymmetrical dependency. You need your grocery money more than your boss needs your individual contributions to the labor process. That's why we form together the political parties, civic organizations, and labor unions. It gives us the power to bargain together to win the sort of concessions that the vast majority of people would benefit from. That's how many of the decent things we have in society today were won. That's how we got Social Security and Medicare to protect those who, after years of hard work, want security in old age. That's how we got labor regulations so that children could stop working in factories and start being children. And that's how we got the mandate to access public education and so on. God rested on the 7th days. If you got the 6th day off, if you're enjoying your Saturdays, that wasn't given to you by God, that was given to you by the organized labor movement. Now, we've evened the odds in the past. And with new movements like those around Bernie Sanders, the revolt of public sector educators and so on that we're seeing today, there's lots of these. I would encourage you to take part in them. I think we could win something like Medicare for all, taking healthcare away from the market and ensuring it as a right, not just in our lifetimes, but in the next 5-6 years. But what about socialism? I don't want to do a bait and switch. I don't want to talk about the glories of Sweden when in fact I believe in a much more radical vision of change. So I will talk about socialism. I will talk about that means of production stuff. I want to see a more radical break from capitalism. I want to see a socialist society. Now, why? Now, social democracy, the compromise I described before in which certain guarantees were won, but in which there was both still capital and labor fighting over the fruits of society, rested on a class compromise. Workers got concessions, and through high corporate tax rates and strong sectoral labor bargaining, people enjoyed both high wages, lots of consumer goods, full employment, and expansive welfare state guarantees. This was the case in many of these countries throughout the 50s, the 60s, into the 70s. But when profitability started to dip after the post-war boom by the 1970s, capitalists sought to rewrite the compromise by demanding austerity and deregulation. Again, not because they're bad people, but because they saw their profitability decline and they decided, we don't really know how to fix things, but we know that we need lower taxes and less regulation so we could figure things out. Now, social democracy was dependent on the profits of private firms and then redistributing those profits. It gave capitalists the power to pull the plug on the experiment. So you make democratic inroads into capitalism, but then even though we all have one vote, some people in society have the ability to say, I'm just not going to invest anymore. So there was attempts on the left wing of social democracy, the tradition that I identify with, to take power away from capitalists, take this power to withhold investment away by socializing production, by passing the ownership of corporations from private capitalists to the people who worked at those companies, people who didn't have the same incentive to attack the welfare state. These measures, like the Meidner Plan in Sweden, narrowly failed. But social democracy still persists in some forms in these parts of the world and represents a proven model that's better than we have today. There's also, by the way, a model that in many cases was enacted by socialist parties who participated and have participated for over 100 years in free elections and the democratic transference of powers and so on. The authoritarian model of the Eastern Bloc is not the only legacy of socialism. Now, I think that this social democratic model can be instituted to some extent in the United States. Then the path from social democracy to more radical socialism, of course, is more fraught. It's more unproven. My proposal is that we go to social democracy and we have the same debates and experiments that they had in, say, 1970s Sweden. If people want a socialism beyond social democracy, if it's feasible, then we would have a society where workers cooperatively control their workplace. We would have a society with radically less power differentials than the society we have today. And if you believe in democracy and you believe in the inherent equality of people, then I think you should want that sort of society. I think there would still be a market in certain spheres, like consumer goods, but such a society would be based on the premise that we don't need capitalists. We don't need powerful elites that have an incentive to undermine our democratic reforms. Now, capitalists aren't parasites. They aren't useless. They contribute certain things to production. Capitalists take entrepreneurial risk when they start up new firms. They participate in convening labor together, which means they act and work as managers. Labor doesn't actually create all value. Now, my argument is that workers can collectively do all the productive things that capitalists do without creating this class of people that are permanent owners of production. Now, the society that I describe won't be year zero. This isn't a society that's impossible to imagine. It's fighting for social democracy, then furthering its gains to challenge capitalist private property, expand the welfare state, and replace privately owned firms with worker-controlled enterprises like cooperatives. Perhaps this sounds abstract to you, but fighting for socialism today means fighting for the reforms that will change millions of lives in the here and now. It means ending homelessness and poverty. It means ensuring that no matter who you are, no matter who your parents are, no matter if you're a man or a woman, you will be able to reach your potential and you will have your individuality celebrated by the society that nurtured you. This isn't a fantasy. This is taking the peaks of the societies that were already created in many parts of the world, bringing it to the United States, and then furthering its democratic logic. Thank you.
Thanks, Bhaskar. I know you guys are all worried about this, but trust me, once I get standing, I promise I'm not going to fall, so don't think about it. Well, thanks again to all the sponsoring organizations at Notre Dame. I've been on campus several times. It's great to be back. Bhaskar and I met once in a symposium. Is the lapel, do we need it on? Is the mic not quite right? Got it on. How's it sound? We all right? So? All right, let me hook it up. So the proposition for the evening is it time to give socialism a try? My argument is it's never been a good time to try socialism, and there's never been a better time to realize what a terrible idea it would be for us and for the world. So Bhaskar and I on these points completely disagree. We, of course, didn't know what each other were going to say, and so I had to try to anticipate what he was going to say, but I do know his general views, and I actually appreciate the fact that Bhaskar quite robustly defended something like socialism. Nevertheless, most people that now in 2019 make the case for socialism want still to argue in aspirational terms. If you'd asked me this proposition about socialism in 1986 when I was in college, I would have answered yes. The reason is because I had read the Communist Manifesto 5 times through my freshman year. It kind of has an effect on the mind. I didn't know a lot of economics, and I liked the way it sounded, and I didn't like the kind of greedy consumerism that I saw around me. I loved it aspirationally. But what I kept doing is I kept studying economics because I was essentially a classical liberal. I thought, okay, on any idea, I want to find the best arguments for and against this thing. And at some point, when you're talking about economic policy, you're not talking about Congressman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, whom I looked up the other day. She's talking about socialism. She said, by socialism, I mean that everyone is accorded a certain basic level of dignity. Well, who doesn't want that? That means everybody, I think, probably in the United States that is any sort of moral formation is going to be a socialist under this definition. And so this is always the problem with socialism, is that those who defend it don't want to talk about the actual socialist experiments of the 20th century. It's not like we'd have to deal in imagination and images in our minds, right? Because I know most people, when I was a freshman in college, my image of socialism was actually, it was the image of a wonderful Norwegian village where everybody had enough fish and they'd sort of dance together on Friday nights. Everybody had a Volvo in the garage. I mean, I don't know where this came from, but that was the image in my mind. But ultimately, we want to deal in reality and not merely in the images in the mind. So the reason I think simply that we absolutely don't want to give socialism a try is really for 4 reasons. First is this problem of focusing on aspirations rather than reality, and sometimes a kind of no true Scotsman fallacy. No true Scotsman fallacy is the idea that somebody says, well, no Scotsman would ever marry an American woman, and the guy says, well, what about Jimmy? He's Scottish and his wife is from America. And the guy says, well, no true Scotsman would marry an American woman. You see the move? You narrowly stipulate the definition in order to defend the thesis. So if we're going to talk about socialism, what should we do? Well, we don't want to stipulate a private definition or we can defend anything. So let's talk about what the dictionary definition is. Let's talk about people in, say, the 20th century who self-identified as socialists and who were inspired by socialist thinkers and see what they did. And when we do that, we actually discover something quite stark, all right? So I know it's a little bit pedantic, but I want to give you what Merriam-Webster says socialism is. That's sort of an approximation of what Americans at least mean by this word. Socialism, noun. Definition of socialism, 1. Any of various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods, right? So it sounds better to say that the workers will organize and will control the means of production. Every time this is actually tried, it's the state. Okay, 200 million people aren't going to organize and sort of plan an economy. And so it ends up being a particular elite, a new and much more powerful, virtually all-powerful elite that is in charge of that process. That's what socialism actually means. If you want to have an employee-owner cooperative, you can do that right now in the United States. You can get together, you can start an ESOP, an employee stock ownership program, and actually do that. You're free to do that in a market economy. And so we're not talking about voluntary associations of workers getting together. We're talking about the confiscation of pre-existing private property, value-created private property that's in private hands, that's confiscated by the state and then redistributed. This is Webster himself telling us this, all right? 2A, a system or society of group living in which there's no private property, right? No private property, so I want that to sink in. 2B, a system or condition of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state, all right? 3, a stage of society in Marxist theory transitional between capitalism and communism, distinguished by unequal distribution of goods and pay according to work alone. All right, that's what socialism means. Here's the good news, is that this is not 1900. So we don't have to just sort of imagine or speculate. Okay, well, what happens when a society actually tries to implement that? No soaring rhetoric about what we hope will happen. No sort of ideal that creates a nice image in our minds, but what actually happens when that's tried? Okay, I'm going to give you the list of socialist experiments in the 20th century, and we'll talk about Scandinavia in a minute, all right? Now, these these are socialist experiments. You might say, now I'm going to name communist countries. But what you need to understand about Marxist theory is that communism was the end state, the sort of desired utopia of Marxist theory. There's a capitalist stage of industrialization, then a process where the means of production are collectivized and distributed. And then, according to Marxist theory, the socialist state will wither away in a stateless utopia called communism. So all the death and destruction, there's something like 100 million people killed in what you might think of as communist experiments in the 20th century, were killed under socialism. None ever actually got to communism. They all got stuck in the socialist stage, primarily because Marx got almost all the details of the economics wrong. And so they just got stuck there. Now, if you asked a sort of literate, philosophically literate Soviet citizen, say in the 1970s, standing in a bread line for 4 hours, you know, is this what you want? He would have said, no, of course not. This is the kind of necessary evil, a means to an end to this communist utopia. So not even in Marxist theory was socialism actually an ideal. It was, if anything, sort of kind of a necessary evil. And it was only that vision of that communist utopia that kept people going for so long, despite the evidence of their senses. All right, socialist experiments in the 20th century. If we're going to look at the evidence, right, we're going to look at the evidence of history as opposed to our mere aspirations and our images. The Soviet Union, People's Republic of China, North Korea, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Burma, Albania. So Albania, these are all during the Cold War, of course. Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, East Germany, Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Cuba, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and much more recently, Venezuela. All right, now what do all these places have in common? Large, massive atrocities, depending in part upon the actual size of the population. So in China, 65 million probably killed as a result of these experiments within a couple of decades or so, in part because it's a very large country. Other much smaller countries like Cambodia, maybe between a fourth and a third of the population killed as a result of socialist experiments in a few short years in the 1970s. These are the realities of socialism. It doesn't matter what the aspirations are. If we actually care about people, the question isn't what do we mean to do? The question is, what are we going to actually do? What actually happens when you implement these policies? That's the only relevant moral question. If anything, your good intentions are a distraction from the hard work of asking, what happens when the means of production are collectivized and confiscated in the hands of the state? It's a disaster. And Venezuela, notice, was not a Marxist revolution. It was a democratic socialist experiment that is continuing to work itself out. Now, what do we notice about these countries? Almost all of these countries are countries that had to put up walls and barbed wire to keep people in. Free societies, with all of our warts and all of our problems, when we put walls and fences up, it's to keep people out. That's a basic fact that we want to keep in mind when we're talking about these things. These aren't just sort of academic debates. These kinds of ideas, when implemented in political economies, have actual effects on real people. So socialism, if we defend and talk about what actual socialism is, the way it was implemented in history, and the way it's actually defined and has been widely understood by socialist theorists, fails the test of history. It fails the empirical test of just simply not doing what it claimed to do. It's not anything we should actually want. The third thing is that socialism fails the test of economic truth. Now, the problem, I myself am a philosopher rather than an economist, and so I think philosophy allows you to be a parasite on the other disciplines. And so you can do philosophy, you can talk about anything. But no, I mean, the reality is that it's tempting, if you don't study economics carefully, to just imagine that economics is all about ethics or political ideology. But the question is, okay, is there actual economic knowledge? Are there truths that we discover as a result of studying economics and looking at what's worked and what's not worked, that we simply need to take on board? The economic truths that don't care about our feelings and don't care about our aspirations. And if so, what are those? That is a crucial question. And if you can distinguish the difference between someone's political ideology or their particular philosophical views on politics and the truths of economic reality, then you can actually get somewhere, because you can actually, that's a research program. What are these things that, say, economists across the divide politically actually agree on? Well, they agree actually on a lot of stuff. They agree on the role of division of labor. They agree on the reality of comparative advantage. They agree on opportunity costs. And they agree on the function of prices. What do prices do? What prices do is, you might just think that prices sort of reflect arbitrary decisions by, say, a store clerk or something like that. That's not actually how it works. In a competitive environment with the rule of law, right? So assume the rule of law in a market economy. Don't assume anarchy. Assume a rule of law so you can't kill each other and steal from each other and defraud each other. What prices do is they signal underlying economic realities. So you might have 3 grocery stores trying to sell you milk, right? And then each grocer might like to charge more than he's actually charging. But what he does is he's got to compete with another one, and he also has costs he has to meet, which are determined by the underlying supply and demand. And so what the price ends up doing is it approximates that underlying economic reality. So a functioning price system communicates information about opportunity costs and benefits to everyone that's in the economy. Now, that might not seem like a big deal. Without a functioning price system, people in the economy simply do not have a way to know how to make any sorts of decisions. This is why in the Soviet Union, you got factories that were sort of determined not by what customers wanted, but by production quotas. So they might just produce, say a million size 12 tennis shoes, double E, right? Your incentive isn't to sort of provide things that people will freely buy in a market at a price they're willing to pay. Your incentive is to please the regulator that's dictated the quota. So that's why they constantly had shortages, even in a country that was otherwise somewhat productive and had lots of natural resources and lots of human resources, because no functioning price system. So essentially what socialism says is, we're going to refuse to have a system that allows this information to be communicated accurately. That's why it doesn't matter how kind and entirely sanctified the economic planners are, or what Tolkien would call the gatherers and sharers, they don't have access to the information. The only way to know what the right price of something ought to be would be to have access to the information of all the particular people buying it, what they're willing to pay. And the way you find that is through the market process with a functioning price system. Other sort of economic truths that socialism just generally ignores is the role of incentives. Human beings are purposeful agents who do things under different contexts. And so one of the key tasks of any economy is to set things up so that people's incentives are oriented, so that they generally do things that make sense, so that ideally, even if, say, you're the butcher and you're just worried not about your customers but your daughter's braces bill, you, in order to succeed as a butcher, still have to freely provide meat that customers will freely buy at a price they're willing to pay, and to try to do it better than your competitors. So the system orients your sort of natural self-interest, not selfishness per se, just natural self-interest, into an outcome that's socially beneficial. That's what a market is. A market is not someone confiscating wealth from someone else. It's a system with the rule of law and well-described property rights and economic freedom in which people are able to set up mutually beneficial win-win interactions. Now, socialist rhetoric always focuses on inequality. It always focuses on inequities. And the reason is because I think the sort of rhetorical point of socialism is to appeal, first of all, to our subtle envy, but also to a sort of dislike of certain types of inequality. But behind that is very often an economic fallacy called the zero-sum game fallacy. The zero-sum game fallacy just claims that in an economic exchange, if somebody wins, somebody else has to lose. So it's like chess or checkers, right? The rules of the game are set up so that if there's a winner, then there has to be a loser. This is not how normal market exchange works. When you go to the grocery store, again, is the grocer standing there saying, okay, let's play rock, paper, scissors, and if you lose, you give me all your money, right? That's not how it works. What happens, you go in, and if he's charging too much, you leave. If not, you say, okay, well, I want the groceries more than I want the money. And he wants the money more than he wants the groceries. That is a win-win exchange. Now, that's hard to get nailed down, to get a system that is well designed like that. But that's a functioning price system, rule of law, private property rights, and opportunities for exchange. And you get markets like that that are mutually beneficial to each other. That's all it is. So the problem with using a word like capitalism rather than socialism is actually a socialist word from the 19th century. Just talk about something like economic freedom and rule of law. Help you sort of clarify this point. Now, the zero-sum game actually works its way in to the socialist description of capital and labor. All right, so the idea, a key part of certainly Marxist theory and at least socialist rhetoric, and of course they're non-Marxist socialists, is that there's this intrinsic enmity between different classes of society, between the capitalists who own the means of production and the workers who are presumably paid a wage. Now, Marx predicted with Engels in the Communist Manifesto that what would happen is that the capitalists would say hire somebody to make shirts in his factory and then take those out to the market, sell them for more than they cost to produce. And that was surplus value because the worker had been exploited because the thing was only worth as much as it cost to produce. It's called the labor theory of value. So Marx thought value came entirely from the labor. And so he assumed then that even though the capitalists would go back and reinvest in more intensive capital equipment and make the workers more productive, they'd end up making less and less. And he would get richer and richer, and then all the money would end up in the hands of a few greedy capitalists, and the vast majority of the workers would end up, those still working, with absolutely no money. Well, when Marx wrote that in 1848, the wages of workers in factories in London were going up rather than down. And the reason is any economist will tell you, or any kid that's taken Econ 101, is that your labor is more valuable when you have capital-intensive equipment. If you're a worker that is using a tractor, your labor is going to be worth more to an employer than if all you can use is a shovel. Whether you own that tractor or not, your labor is going to be valuable. Because remember, in a market economy, your labor also is subject to competition. Right? So if you have a skill, there are other people that are going to want your labor. And so the boss can't just pay you whatever he wants. He has to compete with other potential employers. And so what that means is that the product, the sort of fruit of work and of production, is a combination of ideas, of particular opportunities, of locations, sometimes luck, labor, and capital. Labor, in fact, ends up in an information-intensive economy like ours to become a sort of diminishing part of the equation. But labor itself, even Marxists generally now admit that the labor theory of value is wrong. The problem is it's the whole basis of Marxist theory, because once you undercut it, you realize actually this system of capital and labor working together itself creates value for those that are involved and for everyone else. It's not a matter of wealth getting extracted from one and going to the other. And so even if the labor theory of value disappears in socialist arguments, usually this zero-sum game understanding of the economy is retained, in which if one wins, then someone else has to lose. That's the kind of fundamental fallacy that we know empirically is not true. We know that market economies, for instance, that trade with each other, we traded with Japan after World War II, for instance. That's not an extractive process. Both the United States and Japan benefited from that, precisely because trade allows us to divide our labor, it allows us to focus on our comparative advantage. Again, this is just sort of microeconomics 101 stuff. But socialism ultimately has to either obscure these things or outright deny them. And I've had discussions sometimes with socialists who simply deny that there are any economic truths, that it's all just simple ideology. The question is, whatever economic system we want to set up, it needs to be an economic system that accommodates known economic realities. So we want to focus on socialism as is actually defined and has been practiced in the 20th century, focus on what's actually happened when these things have been implemented, and then focus on the known facts and realities of economics. Now, what about Scandinavia? Everyone, including Bernie Sanders, loves to talk about Scandinavia. The problem is that Scandinavia is not socialist, according to the standard definition. Socialism has to do with the government ownership of the means of production and a dissolution of private property. None of the Scandinavian countries qualify. Now, you could have said in 1975 that Sweden was about 50% government-owned industry. So it was, you could sort of say it's half socialist, and it was in fact democratic socialism, and it was not, as opposed to revolutionary socialism. It was also moribund. And if you look at what the Scandinavian countries have done since the 70s and 80s, every single one of them has been turning against it for all of the obvious reasons. Sluggish growth, high unemployment, things that you don't want. So yes, there's a large kind of social welfare state, They still have that and have large sort of marginal income taxes, but it's not socialism. So if we want to talk about what kind of social safety net should we have, what kind of means-tested welfare program should we have, great, let's have a conversation about that. But that's not socialism. That's something else. And if you don't believe me, just look at what the president of Denmark said in 2016. He was tired of the country being called socialist. He said, no, we have a vibrant social welfare program, but we have a market economy. And if you don't believe me, 2 independent surveys, the Index of Economic Freedom by the Conservative Heritage Foundation and the Economic Freedom in the World Index by the Fraser Institute in Canada, you can just Google these and see, they list in terms of economic freedom, the countries that are most free, in terms of rule of law, private property, contract rights, regulation, all these kinds of things in economic freedom, and the ones that are least free. All of the Scandinavian countries are in the top 20. On the Index of Economic Freedom, they all fall in the mostly free category with the United States. And the ones that are, in fact, the most free end up, for the most part, being quite small countries, even city-states like Hong Kong and Singapore. So these are actually, on many metrics, very economically free countries. These are not socialist countries. So let's not do the kind of bait and switch and talk about Scandinavia, because that's what's in most of our minds. None of you that came here sympathetic to socialism were thinking, yeah, let's get some Stalinism. That sounds awesome. Right? None of you were thinking that. You were thinking of Scandinavia. That's what I can tell you. I did an independent study in college on socialized medicine in Sweden, because this was the image that was in my mind too. But they've been moving away from semi-socialist policies since the 1970s and 1980s. India, which Bhaskar mentioned, India actually started out semi-socialist after its independence until about 1990, and it had very dreadful growth, serious economic problems. There's still hundreds of millions of people that are absolutely poor in India, but what's happened since the 1990s is market reforms, right? Not more socialism, far less socialism. More innovation, more economic freedom. Now, India has very serious problems. I'm not implying otherwise, but they turned their backs on socialism after trying it. They unfortunately stayed a British colony slightly too long, and so 1948, the British were trying socialism, which also turned out very badly. So the actual socialist experiments in the 20th century have been unmitigated disasters. Democratic socialist experiments have tended to be short-lived for obvious reasons. You can actually look up the economic realities. Now, so there's still this question of inequality, and so I think we should just kind of deal with the moral question directly. Justice is about treating like things as like and unlike things as unlike. The problem is not that some people have more than others. The only reason that would be a problem is if it were a zero-sum game. Right? If it were a zero-sum game like a pie, if you got a pie and I eat 2/3 of the pie, that just leaves 1/3 for the rest of you, right? Kind of a drag with this crowd, right? So the best we could do is divide it up equally. But what if the economy is not like that? What if wealth is not like that? What if under certain conditions, human beings working together create value and create wealth that was not there before? Then there's no reason to assume ahead of time that just because one person has more than another person, that they confiscated it or extracted it from someone. The late Steve Jobs, not a great guy in his personal life. He did not get rich stealing iPhones from homeless people, right? That's not how it worked. What did he do? He participated in a process of wealth creation that has improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people, his employees and customers and himself. Right? That's how market economies work. They actually increase and channel the creative capacities of human beings made in the image of the creative God. So what we want is an economic system that allows us to do that. And then finally, I'm at Notre Dame, I teach at Catholic University. Socialism fundamentally contradicts central Christian and Catholic ideas. It fundamentally contradicts the Catholic worldview. And I'm probably out of time, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. So let me just quote Pope Pius XIII from 1931. And he's talking about Christian socialism here. Socialism is based on a theory of human society peculiar to itself and irreconcilable with true Christianity. Religious socialism, Christian socialism are contradictory terms. No one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist. Thank you very much.
we were just having a jog outside, so I don't know where these crutches came from. Okay, so I guess we'll start on a few different points, but for one, at the level of the conflation that I think was happening between communist regimes and the vision of socialism that I was laying out, and in fact, the practice that I was talking about as well. Let's differentiate socialism into three different camps. Now, you could say that there were attempts to create doses of socialism within capitalism through the effort of socialist parties. Now, these parties initially aspired to create socialism after capitalism, but in the end, partially because they weren't in power long enough, partially because of contingent political defeats, partially because some of them just gave up that this was even a good idea, they created socialism within capitalism. And that's one way to define some of these Scandinavian experiments. Then we could talk about, say, socialism outside of capitalism. A lot of these terrible communist governments that tried to compete with the capitalist world and even overtake the capitalist world through the use of command economies, through mobilizing labor, through treating workers like military kind of pawns in a quest to catch up with and defeat the West, kind of socialism outside of capitalism. What I advocate for is a socialism after capitalism, and I believe that putting doses of socialism within capitalism, expanding the spheres of life that aren't hostage to the market, supporting forms of worker organization and certain social rights is in fact a route for us to, over time, move to socialism after capitalism. I do not identify with the communist tradition. I am part of a political tradition that in fact were the earliest opponents in many ways of communism at a time in the 1930s when even American liberals were saying, oh, the Moscow trials, not much to see there, who thought, in venues like The Nation and New York Times, who thought the tales of Ukraine famines were overstated, and even American companies like IBM who saw fit to work with this new Russian government that had lots of need for early computing power in its economy. It was, in fact, people from the democratic socialist tradition that were the earliest advocates of anti-Stalinism. And in fact, when these regimes fell in the 1980s, it was often under banners like the Solidarity movement in Poland, like these other movements that were often under the banner of various forms of democratic socialism and trade union advocacy. Now, I would say, and I'll say this somewhat rudely because we otherwise get along, and we've met on a few occasions, everything you said about the Marxist labor theory of value, I think just on the grounds of edification, you should ignore. Because in fact, Marx was not writing political economy, he was writing a critique of political economy. So in other words, Marx was using the labor theory of value because Ricardo Smith, other 19th century bourgeois economists were using the labor theory of value. He was operating within this framework. If he was writing in the 20th century, he might have, for all we know, used a marginalist theory or something else to make his political case. Marxists don't think that labor is a source of all value. Marxists don't think that the economy is a zero-sum game. Many of the ideas he's describing as Marxist are, in fact, if you want to be technical, Lassallean ideas. So you can look up who Lassalle was and look up Marxist critiques of Lassalle. But I think that was wrong. Otherwise, I think some of our issues are definitional issues. But even the kind of society that I was describing, a society in which there are cooperative forms of labor ownership. Now, what I called for is a society in which instead of being wage laborers, regular employees, people were in fact worker owners, issued shares, and paid not a wage, but in fact shares. Now you tell me whether or not you think that will incentivize people to work more. Now, not only would it incentivize people to work more, but in fact it would create an incentive in labor-saving technology. If I own my place of work and I had a share in my place of work, you better believe I would try to find ways to automate much of my job. Now, I think a lot of these other ideas of why various forms of state socialism failed. I don't like the true Scotsman thing either. I don't like when I talk to people who advocate for capitalism and say like, yeah, you're critiquing this, but this isn't real capitalism. You know, that's an annoying argument. So I would say state socialism, these kind of failures that we saw in the Eastern Bloc and elsewhere, relied on a complete rejection in many cases of the market, which ran into two problems. One, a problem based on calculation, economic calculation, which you brought up. Two, a problems based on incentives. Now, what I advocated was a combination of an expanded state sector, so taking certain spheres outside the market, and an existing sphere of markets for consumer goods. Markets existed before capitalism, they will exist after capitalism. I think both of these would solve the calculation and incentive problems that were brought up. Now, if you're worried about me taking away the market, socialists taking away the market from certain spheres, like for example, healthcare, I would remind you that our healthcare system in the US is less efficient than the healthcare system in other countries where, in fact, healthcare is either in the form of single payer or direct state ownership. Healthcare is just issued. And it's common sense why. Instead of just dealing with hospitals and doctors for care that cannot and should not often be rationed by the market, instead we have to deal with billers, with insurance, with mailers. How many hours have many of you spent on the phone with your insurance company? That's a drain on the economy. It creates useless jobs. It's a waste of human effort and resources. There's not that problem in other countries, including Britain, whose labor government, which you derided, in the late 1940s actually built and established a National Health Service. And the spirit of that National Health Service was that the people who fought against fascism, the people who sacrificed so much throughout the 1930s, throughout the 40s, deserve to be cared for, deserve to be taken care of. And that is, I think, the spirit of a lot of the socialist endeavor. We can't abolish the human condition. We can't make you feel happy. We can't solve all of your problems, but there's certain things in life that you shouldn't have to worry about. You should have a bedrock amount of security. Now, in other spheres, I believe that we can, in fact, take more control of our lives. I think ordinary people can, in fact, be shareholders in their workplaces. Now, would this mean endless meetings? Not necessarily. Large workplaces, this would mean maybe every year or so, there's a meeting where people vote, you have an operating agreement, and so on. But fundamentally, at a normative level, as a socialist, I think that there's needless hierarchy and needless exploitation in society today. I think that we could develop people's capacity so they could truly take part in government. At its most lofty and ambitious, Marxists used to say things like, we want a society in which every cook can govern. Now, I'm not a student of much of Christianity. I have to imagine that there's some sentiment somewhere. On the way here, a friend who is a Catholic socialist was giving me all these quotes to use and so on. And then I'm like, I don't want to use a quote out of context. But every cook can govern, I think, is a assertion of the inherent moral worth of every human being and our capabilities. And maybe every cook can't govern today, but I think we need a society in which we are allowing people to flourish to the point it is possible. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for about 20-30 minutes for some questions. Folks, if you want to stand up there, I'm also going to project a website where you can ask questions anonymously, if the projector works. But for now, feel free to line up and ask questions. We'll try and take multiple questions at a time.
Maybe one.
Okay.
Not too many at a time, or I'll forget the middle one.
We'll do one. We'll do each of you. So you go ahead on the left first.
All right. My name's Thomas, and I'm new to this whole sphere of socialism and capitalism. I study theology here at Notre Dame, and my question is directed towards Dr. J. Richards. Basically, I want to be to the point and say that I don't think you're being intellectually honest to say that socialism goes directly against Christian ideas. What about our very salvation, which is the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is about giving food to the hungry, drink to the thirsty, shelter to those who need shelter? What about the Acts of the Apostles, where they live in community and they pool all their resources together? What about Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who Christ converts into one who sees their salvation dependent upon giving drink to the thirsty, food to the hungry? And so what I'm trying to say is, if we, purely from a Christian perspective, if we extract out a superstructure from Christ and his teachings, it looks a lot like socialism.
Great.
And I think it's a lie to say that the ideas of socialism go directly against Christian
Great.
belief.
Okay, that's a good question. I was quoting Pope Pius XI, so if you disagree on that point, you disagree with him, right? I was just
do
quoting him,
disagree
but I'll
with
tell you why I think you're mistaken. Remember that, that's fine, but I didn't say that. But what is socialism? Again, we're back to definitions. The meaning of socialism involves the state collectivizing the means of production. In Acts 2, the centurions weren't knocking down doors. The Holy Spirit moved the church in Jerusalem, new Christians, right? Jews that had come from around the Roman world at Pentecost. Lots of people away from home, away from work. And then in that situation, the Spirit moved the local people, the new Christians in Jerusalem, to sell their things and to share. Sharing is not socialism. If we just use socialism to mean help poor people, right, forgive others, share amongst our fellow believers, it's completely useless. We're just sort of stipulating the word socialism to mean good stuff, essentially. That's not what the word means. Call those things what they are: sharing, charity, helping others, self-sacrifice. Those are all virtues. They have nothing to do with socialism. They pre-existed socialism, they pre-existed the theory, and they don't have anything to do with the state collectivizing the means of production, which is the primary definition of socialism. So I know you think it's intellectually dishonest, but it's based, I'm just quoting Merriam-Webster's definition of socialism and all the socialist theorists of the 19th and 20th centuries. None of the examples you give have anything to do with the state collectivizing the means of production and dissolving
what
private
my examples
property.
have to do with is ideals, and I think that we should shoot for these high ideals that the scripture gives
I
us.
totally agree. I don't think the state confiscating the means of production and abolishing private property is an ideal. I think it's a disaster, and it doesn't have anything to do with those particular examples. So that's
It does, but
Thank you. We'll go ahead and take 2 questions right here.
This is for Mr. Sunkara. I'm Sean.
closer to the mic.
Closer. So basically, you talked a lot about debt, and that's something we all struggle with. I'm paying for school, and particularly nationally, like our national debt is massive, and it's only growing every day. And so I was wondering, with this whole collectivizing of the means of production, how do you propose to do that without either massacring all the capitalist owners or plunging us even further into debt and essentially screwing over my generation with more debt?
Well, if you actually look at, let's say, what I mentioned before. Sorry, we were supposed to take 2.
That's
But what
okay.
I
Go
mentioned
ahead.
before was the Mitre plan. The plan of that was essentially Swedish unions basically saying, we're making less aggressive wage demands, and some of these savings, like let's say every year there was a 5% increase in wages. Instead, there's going to be a 3% increase in wages, but some of this excess profit would in fact go into a shareholder fund. And over time, over the course of 20, 30 years, workers collectively would control their companies, but in fact, capitalists are being compensated. That's one kind of model of a transition. So I don't propose kind of a violent path to change on moral and ethical grounds, but also, it's just not the kind of societies we live in. In revolutionary Russia and that era, these are societies that were autocratic societies where the only way to overthrow a monarchy was through kind of violent revolution. In fact, democracy, having a parliament, these were past victories of the workers' movement, having representative democracy. In the past, people with this kind of logic of defending hierarchy and privilege would say that only the literate should vote, only those who own property, and so on. So when I look at the representative institutions of a society in a capitalist democracy like the United States, I see partial victories. I don't see the enemy or something to oppose.
I'm going to interject with a question that we're getting from a lot of people anonymously right now. And the question is essentially for both of you tackling like the practical implications of this debate in politics today. So all of the conversation around a few key issues, especially Medicare for all, and then the Green New Deal and climate change legislation in general, and where you think this ideological debate stands on that, and what policies you think you should advocate for based on the ideologies that you were displaying today. So, Dr. Richards, you can start.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, the idea that we've somehow sort of shrunk government in recent years is a complete myth. I mean, just look at the number of regulations. Look at the list of pages added to the Federal Register in the last 15 or 20 years. And whether Republicans or Democrats are in office, there was about $1 trillion of regulation added to the economy during President Obama's 8 years. I don't think President Obama was a terrible person, but that's just the reality. And those are things that are essentially drags on the economy. And so the trick when you're developing policies is that you want laws and regulations that have the most benefits with the least costs. And so we tend not to do that. But I do know that in parts of the market where the government is deeply involved, you get inflated costs. And where it's not, you get innovation and good deals. So which parts of the market have continued to go up about twice or more the rate of inflation? Education, housing, and healthcare. In all these cases, we have what economists call a third-party payer problem. Where have prices gone down? Consumer goods. So if you want more people to have access to something, you want to increase the supply and reduce the cost. The best way to do that is to improve the market mechanisms in those places. The reason, for instance, that housing has gone up is because the federal government, for very well-meaning reasons, manipulated the housing market over a period of years and ended up destroying the underwriting standards on loans and a bunch of details. I've written a whole book on this called Infiltrated if you're really into mortgage-backed securities and all that stuff. I know you're not. But the point is that where the market mechanism is set up well, where the price system works well, it does wonders. It's not a utopia, but it increases the availability of goods or services, and it reduces their costs. And so if there's something like education, I hate to say it, but the addition of grants and loans, bad news, it increased the cost of college education. I can tell you that incentivizes schools to increase the cost, and you're now bearing it. Right? That's a government intervention that's caused that problem. And again, you can see that. I'm not saying government's terrible. Government has a God-given role to play in establishing and maintaining the rule of law. But when it decides, it gets between customers and employers and employees, it ends up actually increasing the costs. And quite contrary to what Bhaskar said, it makes it much less efficient rather than more efficient.
Well, it depends on the sector. I mean, certain sectors would be better off with through market competition. Certain sectors are natural monopolies that should be under the control of the state. I think healthcare is one. I mean, this is a debate that healthcare experts have had all around the world. I would say even among people who are otherwise ardent capitalists, there's a strong minority, if not close to a majority of them, who would probably agree with me that in fact a single payer system is more efficient. Because in the same way that even most libertarians don't advocate for private ownership of highways, many people are now coming around to Medicare for all as a common sense a solution. Now, taking Medicare for all and putting it in the hands from private insurers into the hands of a single state insurer would essentially mean decommodifying, taking out of the market 1/6 of the U.S. Economy. That would be a big step, but it would catch us up with every other industrialized country in the world. So I think that's probably the most relevant and the most important debate that we could have right now. Life expectancy is slipping for many reasons in the United States. We're not up to the standards that we should be given how wealthy our country is. And I think that we can save, over the course of a couple decades, millions of lives through doing something like Medicare for all.
All right, I'll take your question and one question over there before we answer any. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I'm just, first of all, really delighted to see socialism being debated at Notre Dame. Who would have thought? I'm most curious, as a question for Dr. Richards. I'm a scholar of imperialism, And I was
Say
very
it again,
curious.
I missed that last sentence.
Oh, I said I'm a scholar of imperialism.
Of materialism?
Imperialism.
Imperialism.
Yes,
Gotcha.
colonialism. Yes.
Gotcha.
And I'm always very curious to see the many crimes of communist states frequently cited and heaped at the feet of Stalin and other communist dictatorships. And yet frequently capitalism is described as though we're only talking about North America and only talking about North American democracies. I would also advocate or suggest that we include, for instance, in the death toll of capitalism, what Mike Davis, the scholar, referred to as the late Victorian Holocaust of colonialism. We can include the Vietnam War, which killed over 3 million Vietnamese people. We include the recent invasion of Iraq, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. And I would say, and not to say to excuse the crimes of communism, but to say that embedded in capitalism has always been not simply the market of free labor, but has always been this history of imperialism. And curiously enough, socialism and Marxism have often been more popular in the third world. And even when we talk about the adoption of capitalism in India, yes, okay, so many people in India now have cell phones and good jobs. We also talk about hundreds of thousands of farmers who are killing themselves because they are seeing their lands taken from them as capitalist agriculture comes and defrauds them of their land. So it's not to say that communism obviously was a fantastic system, but I think when people are reacting to capitalism, they're not simply reacting to, say, questions of, do I have health care in the first world? They're also reacting to the massive death toll that has been the legacy of capitalism and cannot be written out of that story. And I think that, if you're going to say, well, okay, how can you advocate for communism if you're thinking of the death toll? One could also say, well, how can you advocate for capitalism and not include the death toll of late Victorian Holocaust and et cetera?
Of course, you're comparing apples and oranges because the 100 million that I talked about, it wasn't Soviet, Soviets also killed non-Soviets, right? We killed Vietnamese. Let's just grant, right, that all of that is bad. Let's say, which I oppose the invasion of Iraq was bad. That's not us killing our own people for economic reasons. It's bad things that market economies have done. But nothing in my argument says that market economies are intrinsically virtuous or always do nice things. I'm talking about a system of rule of law, private property, contracts, free exchange. So farmers getting run off their land, that's not anything I've defended. I've defended the value of particular and discrete and detailed property rights. Now, how you get those in countries that don't have them is a tough question. But the fact that, say, you want to identify the United States as a capitalist country has done some bad things doesn't tell us anything about the economic system. It just tells us Americans have done some bad things. It doesn't tell us anything about the coordination problem or the problems with socialism. That 100 million death toll in the 20th century, that is entirely deaths within countries that tried socialist experiments as a result of economic experiments. So it's not various foreign wars or anything like that. That's the statistic. There is nothing like that in the free world, nothing whatsoever. Every example you gave is a capitalist or a market economy doing something bad, which I totally agree. I don't like. I'm ambivalent about the Vietnam War. I suppose.
It also depends on whether it's intrinsic to the structure. So let's say if we're having this abstract debate about systems, right? Now you got me defending capitalism, but I think it's worth thinking about. We know that the history of capitalism is in fact, and I take your point, and I agree with it, but the history of capitalism is in fact intertwined with the history of slavery and then intertwined with the history of imperialism. The question is, could you have had capitalism without these things? So in other words, and I think in fact yes, so for example, let's say slavery's impact on capitalism, which is very, very real. It's cheap raw materials that fed capitalist industry. Now, can you imagine a sharecropping system or some extreme low-wage labor that might have fed that capitalist machine, albeit a little bit slower? I think probably yes. So in other words, I disagreed when he did it with kind of just these out of context, kind of abstract, very contingent historical examples to attack the legacy of all forms of socialism. I think if we're going to try to think of capitalism as a model, we have to kind of separate the type of imperialism and slavery that was done in certain forms of feudal societies that continued under capitalism. If you follow the example of your logic, then wouldn't you also score under socialism the deaths in Afghanistan by Soviet troops and so on? So I think if we're going to have a debate about structures, it can kind of sometimes be a red herring on both counts.
All right, over there.
How's it going? Bhaskar? Dr. Richards. Basically, you were making a point. We shouldn't try socialism. I didn't quite follow. You were talking about prices and markets.
Yeah.
What is it about democratically run business and firms and co-ops that are antithetical to prices and markets?
Right. Nothing whatsoever, but the word, the devil's in the words here. Democratically run. There's absolutely
co-ops
nothing,
with no laws.
I'm talking nothing
Every decision
whatsoever.
is made
Nothing whatsoever.
collectively.
So if you want, you can do that in the United States right now. And remember, tech companies in California pay workers very often in stock options. You can go, if you work for GM, you can go buy stock in that company right now. Or if you want a much more kind of intimate relationship between capital and labor, you can start an ESOP, an employee stock. It's an employee-owned company in which you essentially own chunks of it, and you're also workers. That's a corporate model. I'm not saying there's one kind of ideal type corporate model. I actually think the incentives on that make sense. I'm sort of surprised that there aren't more employee stock ownership corporations than there actually are. I think part of it is that a lot of people, the truth of the matter is not everybody wants to be an entrepreneur and a business owner. It's highly stressful. You're bearing risk. You're worried about payroll. And a lot of people like a kind of regular paycheck. And so maybe everybody doesn't want to do that. But I've got friends that have started ESOPs. I think it's terrific insofar as it works. And if it's actually superior economically, then it's going to take off. I actually think the kind of highly short-term corporate governance processes that we have right now are suboptimal. I think that I'm hoping that they will be replaced by something better. But I actually think you don't necessarily have to have an owner cooperative. This is what tech companies figured out themselves, is that they very often pay employees early on with stock options, right? They've actually very low wages, but the possibility of doing well if the company goes public. That's what that is. So it's very hard. I mean, who exactly is the proletariat at Apple, in the United States? I think that the kind of simple distinctions between capital and labor that are sort of imported from 19th century factories or something like that, I just don't think that they have all that much explanatory power in the 21st century.
But the working class is simple. If you have to work for a living, if you're dependent on someone else to work, if you could get fired at any moment, if you are sick or you have to take care of your kid and you miss 2 shifts, and then you don't have a job the next day. I mean, this condition of being dependent on a boss is the reality for most people today, for billions around the world.
How's that different, though, from an employer, right, who has to pay those people and has to keep payroll
Of
going?
course.
Has to keep. He's
no,
also
absolutely.
dependent.
No, I completely agree. That's why one of the fundamental points that socialists make is that, in fact, capitalists themselves are not motivated by these negative things like greed. They themselves are captive to the market. If I'm a low-wage employer and I'm paying a fast food worker $10 an hour, I might in my heart want to pay all my employees $25 an hour. But I know that I'll either not stay in business or I'll be run out of competition by someone else. Caldors paid people better than Walmart does, and I'm 29, I vaguely know Caldors. I'm sure none of you do here. So that tells you what happened to Caldors. So can we create a system, in other words, that incentivizes different behavior? And I think that's a real question.
Thank you.
Howdy. This is a question for Mr. Sunkara. So I know you said you don't know quite that much about Catholicism, but this question more deals with the Catholic objection, particularly the one brought up by Pope Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum. So I was wondering, I was interested in how you would answer his 3 objections to socialism, namely that it infringes on an individual's right to own property that he has invested in, that it disrupts natural familial relations by putting the state in the family, and that it causes disruption to society by encouraging hatred between individuals who happen to have different amounts of wealth.
Right. So I would actually agree with the first two points. I mean, that's much the point, right? So in other words, I think that capitalist private property, again, not personal property or not kind of collectively owned property, is inherently based on exploitation and built in hierarchical way, and I think we should reject it on normative grounds if we have a replacement to it. Capitalist private property also helped fuel, was a huge advance over previous forms of production, over feudalism and so on. I think we can supersede it. On the second point, certain forms of familial relations should be disruptive, especially in the context that he was speaking. So in other words, a corollary that happened a lot in the 20th century when women first entered the workforce in some places like in Sweden, the 60s, and also when they began to get higher wages, was in fact divorce rates increased, right? So in other words, is that a breakdown of some of the traditional family structures? In a sense, yes, but it also meant that women in bad and abusive relationships are no longer economically dependent on their husbands. So in other words, in the same way that the struggle was fought, and the struggle, by the way, continued into the late 20th century and even many European countries, Catholic countries, for, let's say, the right to divorce, doesn't mean that people advocate the right to divorce, which I'm sure everybody advocates now today, but was not a very popular position, probably even on this campus, a few decades ago. It doesn't say you think most people should get divorced, or everyone should get divorced. It means you believe in the right. And what I would say is that you want to allow people the economic power to leave bad situations. You want to prevent abuse and so on, so that we can actually form partnerships and form families on a more equal footing. And as it relates to children, it's different, obviously. The authority that the parents wield over their children should be justified, because it is justified, though obviously it's within limits, right? Like you can't abuse your child and so on. But yeah, so I would say that what he was fearing was in fact correct on those 2 points, at least.
Unsurprisingly, the top question online is also about a pope. And the question is, Dr. Richards, you quote Pope Pius, what about the current Pope Francis and his capitalism gives a moral cloak to inequality?
The
quote from Pope Francis is, capitalism gives a moral cloak to inequality. And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, and I like Pope Francis a lot. I don't agree with him on everything he says on economics. I think that his economic views very much reflect the kind of Peronist Argentinian situation. When he's talking about capitalism, he's using it as an ideological term. And that's very often, actually, if you look at a lot of the encyclicals, including ones I've referred to, when popes use the word capitalism, this is a kind of European thing to do, they talk about it as an ideology. I am talking about a system of institutions and incentives, which includes, again, rule of law, limited government, private property, contract laws, and widespread opportunities for economic freedom. That's the system I'm talking about. It's also the system that economists overwhelmingly agree is the way that countries emerge from absolute poverty and raise large numbers of people out of poverty into generally flourishing lives. It's not like this is a mystery how this works. We actually know at the beginning of the 21st century what institutions and incentives and processes and laws allow countries that are formerly poor to become relatively wealthy. The Korean Peninsula, just compare South and North Korea, right? Same culture, same ethnicity, same background, same basic natural resources and climate. Two different political economies, run the experiment for 60 or 70 years. And South Korea is not an ideal, right? But one was a Stalinist, socialist, and communist experiment. One was one that increased these institutions, and we see the effect. So I would argue on empirical grounds, focus on those things that actually help large numbers of people economically. I don't think Pope Francis would disagree with it framed that way. I do think if you're thinking of capitalism as a system by definition in which some people exploit other people, then of course I'm going to agree. But that's why I think we've got to define terms carefully. Great.
Since we're running out of time, I ask that folks keep their questions short and don't ask follow-up questions. So go ahead over there.
Hello, my name is Robert, and so America did have a very comprehensive, and this question is from Mr. Sunkara. America did have a very comprehensive welfare state during the New Deal, along with a bunch of other European countries, but since the 70s, it's been rolled back due to the threat of capital strike and capital flight. So even if somehow social democracy was to be reestablished in the United States like you want it to be, how would you propose that these progressive gains be sustained in the face of challenges posed by capital?
Yeah, I think that in fact, capitalists will have to, the United States is not a small export-driven kind of a European country. In fact, I think there's a lot more latitude to initiate pretty sweeping reforms and to build a welfare state. And by the way, that doesn't necessarily mean nationalization. You said 50% of the Swedish economy was nationalized. I guess you might have meant like public sector use, but like actually in terms of nationalized industry, it was only 11%. So it was less than other countries like France and so on that were both more capitalist and more statist. So again, I think like one of the, I won't say tricks because I know you do believe it, but one of the things that keeps being said is I think the conflation of the market and certain incentives with capitalism, and then saying capitalism is just an ideology. What I keep questioning is the ownership structure, right? So in other words, what I want you to defend is the fact that the initial shareholders or the capitalist is actually the one who owns the shares, and then it chooses if they want or not to dilute their shares by giving some to employees or whatnot, as opposed to creating structures where people are kind of by mandate and by structure are given shares or at least can vote on an operating agreement. But I think there's a lot of latitudes, there's a lot of flexibility that we have to make reforms here. I think ultimately social democracy will be unstable in the long run. Eventually, workers will start making more and more militant wage demands because these social welfare programs, these reforms, will insulate them from the penalties that come from going on strike, so in other words, they'll be less market dependent, they'll be more militant. They'll start making higher wage demands. Eventually, these wage demands, I think, will make inroads into the profitability of firms. And companies there'll be employer lockouts, there'll be strikes, there'll be a lot of the industrial conflict that you saw across the West in the early 1970s. That conflict, that crisis of social democracy, was resolved through a few steps to the right. So people like Tony Blair and Schroeder in Germany came and they said, all right, we're going to restore profitability. So we're going to fight against these strikers. We're going to deregulate a little bit. Then we're going to make these companies profitable, but we're still going to tax their profits and sustain as much of the welfare state as we can. That was the solution of kind of third way social democracy and what social democracy has become in Europe. Then there was a center of social democracy that I think kind of pretended that there was no crisis and things could go on as they could. Then I think where there is interesting potential answers and where my tradition would lead would be the left wing of social democracy that said that there is a real crisis and we could resolve this crisis through enhancing worker democracy and employee ownership and these other measures. In which case, that's why I keep mentioning Sweden. It's not actually, I know some socialists, it might be a bait and switch. For me, it's in fact, this was kind of the experiment of these ideas in practice, both the creation of these welfare states and then eventually how do you respond to the crisis that emerged into it. And this is a terribly, I was going to say a bad word, but this is a very bad thing to do, and I'm embarrassed by it, but I'm going to give it to you for free. But I have a book coming out next month, kind of premised around this very question, kind of. So I'll, if afterwards, give me your address or something, I'll mail you a copy.
Thank you so much.
All right, we only have time for 2 more questions, so I'm sorry everyone else who's in line. You can go ahead, and then I'll have you go right after.
There we go. All right, so this is a question for Mr. Sunkara. When you speak of employee-owned workplaces, I can only assume that some workplaces will be owned by hundreds, if not thousands of workers. Surely, this model will be a high risk for cyclical majorities. By this, I mean different majorities rising when choices are being made between multiple options so that no one majority wins out. This leads to inefficient decision-making and incoherent expression of group will. To make things worse, the political scholar Kenneth Shepsley has shown that the more voters in a decision-making group, the hundreds and thousands I reference, the more mathematically at risk that group is for cyclical majorities. Therefore, I can only assume your worker-owner model will be very susceptible to this detrimental phenomenon. How do you address that?
Well, yeah, I think it's a very good question, and the question can be resolved the same way we resolve democratic questions within our societies today, which is we adopt representative models. Operating agreements might have a combination of people who are elected by lot. At small firms, let's say you're at a coffee shop that's a co-op, you could in fact probably make every management decision collectively at weekly meetings or something like that. At larger firms, you cannot, right? And you also need to, at least temporarily, hire managers that have the ability to fire and discipline people. So you do need both at the macro level, firm failure. This is one of the reasons why firms didn't work in the Soviet Union, because they only had soft budget constraints, and inefficient labor techniques couldn't hold on and couldn't, and in fact, persisted, and there was waste of raw materials and whatever else. So I do think you need firm failure. The difference is, and I think this is a key for it to actually be socialism, is that when your firm fails and you fall, you won't be market dependent. You'll be falling on the cushion of a welfare state through active labor market policies and whatnot. You'll be retrained, and if you want, put into an expanding part of the economy and so on. But I think these are good questions, but I think they can in fact be resolved. But it's through the use of representative institutions, the delegation of power, and so on. And the last point, I'll let you have the last word, but this is also one reason why, even in theory, I've never been a communist, even in the Marxian sense, because I think what it implies is that there will be a point of politics that will be post-political. So in other words, even if there are no more class antagonisms the way there is under capitalism, if we wanted to get across a river, and I wanted to build a bridge and you wanted to build a tunnel, I mean, that in fact is a political conflict that requires a state to mediate it, and it requires representative institutions. The institutionalization of knowledge and techniques and so on, I think, will always require a state. Much in the same way that I mentioned before, that a kind of authority of a parent over a child is justified, I think the authorities of a state above us is justified. I think even you would agree with that, is justified, but has to be constantly questioned and limited in its sphere and held to account. So freedom of religion, freedom of speech, this bedrock of a civil society has to be there. My fear with capitalism is that the concentration of economic power, in fact, bleeds into these other spheres and diminishes the possibility for real democracy. But of course, you could say that the same might be true in a different sort of society. But that's why we resolve it through politics, through creating structures and things like that. But it'll be a constant, ongoing project, not a snap your fingers, we're here kind of thing.
And this stuff, by the way, is worked out in ESOPs all the time. And what ends up happening is that the workers vote and they end up with people that they delegate to make these decisions because it's otherwise impractical. But remember, we're talking about two completely different things. We're talking about socialism as actually practiced and as defined, right, and as the term has been used, and voluntary associations of people deciding to get together, risk their own capital and savings, and start a company which then they share in this particular way. That's a corporate structure within a market economy. There's nothing wrong with that. I think that's great. So we've already got that. And so don't confuse these two things and think we're talking about these sort of worker cooperatives that are voluntary as if we're talking about socialism. We're talking about something else.
Great, and the last question.
Yeah, my last question's about the Nordics, and it's the Nordic countries.
The Nordic countries.
And it's sort of prompted by Dr. Richards' use of the Heritage Freedom Index, which it was kind of, I found frustrating because you really tried to focus the definition of socialism on state or collective ownership of the means of production, and that's primarily, if you look at the methodology, is primarily based on how much regulation is in the economy, which I understand you don't like regulation, but it seems sort of like a separate issue from who owns things.
Yeah.
And if you look at, I think Finland owns, like state-owned enterprises make up more than 50% of GDP. In Norway, it's almost 80, or it's more than 80%, and they have big sovereign wealth funds. Right. And that sort of leads to a broader question with about the financialization of more capital assets. Mm-hmm. If that is a way to mitigate your critique of socialism and integrate more market structures into a socialist state where there's collective ownership, and that's
there's such a bunch of questions in there, but you're right. And so notice that the definition of socialism. I thought the only way to do this fairly and neutrally is, I mean, what the dictionary is this kind of culmination of how the term has been used. If we're not going to bait and switch and defend something that wasn't the proposition, that's why I turned to Merriam-Webster. I didn't know exactly what it was going to say, right? And so it was government ownership or control. And so I think you're right. So in principle, the government could regulate every detail of business so that it was effectively owning it, right? So that every transaction, every price, production quotas, even though they're sort of nominally in private hands, is controlled, that would effectively be socialism, and that's actually one of the definitions. And so at some point, there's a sort of limit in which regulatory control just effectively becomes ownership. I just don't see any reason to think that that's a good thing. Now, Norway's got a very kind of unusual situation. It's got a small population of 5 million people, massive natural resources. They've got large private corporations and the government-owned stocks, right? And so I don't actually think whatever the Nordic model is, there's any reason at all to assume that it would extrapolate. I think this is one of the kind of key problems of socialism. This was Leo XIII's problem. One of the problems with socialism is that it completely mixes up the notion of scale. Different social sizes have different logics. So the integrity and the logic of relations in a family is different from the logic in a parish or a town or a city or a small ethnically homogeneous country the size of Washington State with particular quirky kind of cultural regulations. Even if something works well in Norway, right? Let's just grant that. There's no reason to assume that would work well in a large continent-bestriding nation state. And if you look at the socialist experiments that were tried in large countries, that's where the disasters mostly were. Serious disasters. And I think because socialism essentially says, ultimately, the logic of the coercive state is going to apply to society as a whole, and this is what Leo's point was. It gets between the mother and the father, the parent and the child, the priest and the parishioner, the employer and the employee, everyone. Everything is finally subsumed into the coercive power of the state. And that's what Leo was worried about. That's precisely what I'm worried about, and I think the 20th century bore that out.
I think we want often these structures to be in between us. I mean, if you're in a happy relationship, you don't want this state involved. But if you are not, then you might need the protections that come from a wider society. If you're happy with your health insurance plan, then you might not need Medicare for all. If you're uninsured or underinsured, like many of us are, then you do. I think this bedrock of protections is undeniable. And you might say this is a bedrock of protections that's existing within a capitalist economy that's fundamentally reliant on the profits of capitalist firms. My argument is that the existence of a small group of capitalists who have tremendous wealth and powers, the millionaires and billionaires of this society, are making it almost impossible to enact these sorts of reforms. And in fact, if we're to enact these reforms, we're going to need to erode their power, and we're going to need to expand the power of workers. I think if you follow that logic to its conclusion, it will mean that we'll have to empower workers to take more control over not just managing existing corporations, but through the use of, yes, public banks and other criteria, being able to start new businesses. And this won't look like a dramatically different society. I think this will look a society where everybody's a little bit healthier, a little bit more empowered in their workplace, and so on. But the point of a good society, and I think this is something we would all agree, isn't just what we do at work. It's about the time we spent with our loved ones, with our families, and so on. And it's my deep fear, and the reason why I became a socialist in the first place, is that our future Einsteins and Da Vinci's, or even those ordinary people with ordinary abilities that I was talking about, are spending their lives today in demeaning low-wage work, in sweatshops all around the world, and are not going to flourish in their individualities. They won't have the sorts of experiences that any of us have today. And I think that democratic socialism can resolve many of these problems, as imperfect as it is. But again, this isn't a year zero, I thought socialism was a good idea, but now I'm living in Soviet Russia thing. This is an experiment. It's a provisional utopia we'll have to move towards. There'll be democratic mandates where I think left of center governments in the future will be able to march a few steps down this road. Then there'll be reversals. We'll have to backpedal a bit. This has been the practice of countries across Western Europe. And I think the return of democratic socialism in America today, Bernie Sanders, AOC, all these other politicians that I'm sure all of you know of, this is just us returning to the norm that we have elsewhere. And even if you don't really like the development, I think you'll like your state-run healthcare.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our speakers.
I'll come to you.